All right. Welcome everybody to the very first video lecture, the first of many in this series, from yours truly, Mr. Perry. All right, so for today we're talking about Lord of the Flies, and I want to cover a lot of the background and some of the finer points of the novel that hopefully didn't escape you on the first read, but might have, and a lot of useful information that might assist you during the class. All right, so the first thing I want to do is kind of set the stage here. I want you to imagine that you were alive in 1945 at the end of World War II. All right, you had just lived through the war. You experienced it all. You heard through the news about, all of the devastating aspects of the war. You witnessed the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, and saw all the images of the Holocaust and the dropping of the atomic bomb. And it's now finally all over. The war has come to an end, and just kind of, I want you to think about the fact that these would have been the images in the newspapers of the past 6 years. All right, so again, we've got all of these people in the background here supporting this leader, Adolf Hitler. And for any rational thinking individual, this certainly would have been a stressful thing to witness. And again, with the Holocaust and the images that came out following the liberation of the camps, and just, acknowledging the widespread suffering that people were subject to for so long. Again, with the bombings and with the battles, and especially in areas like Poland, where just entire cities were leveled, and again, just widespread destruction and kind of indiscriminate killing on a very, very grand scale. Not to mention the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Actually, Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the proper order. Again, speaking of indiscriminate killing, just this level of destruction, unleashing this level of destruction that the world had never seen before. A picture here of the storming of Normandy. Again, another scene of just incredible suffering and death and destruction. And then, not to mention, amidst all of this, the blind allegiance that so many people had to the Nazi Party and to leaders like Hitler and Joseph Stalin in Russia, and the gulags, and again, just story upon story of just death, and incredible destruction. So this is what you've been witnessing, right? This is all you've heard about. This has dominated the news for quite a long time. So definitely not the happiest of pictures, and this is exactly what British school teacher and author William Golding witnessed, and it is one of the reasons why he ended up writing Lord of the Flies in 1954. William Golding was a school teacher who lived in Britain, was very much in the thick of World War II, witnessed, well, really World War I and World War II. Witnessed all of that, and teachers in general, we like to look at students and see kind of like the future, right? We want to be optimistic, and we want to be hopeful when we think about the future. And as a teacher, and going through everything that he went through, it was really kind of a troubling situation for him. And writing Lord of the Flies was one of the things I think that allowed him to sort of process the war and deal with it, and try to make sense of it, and point out some things about humanity in general. Now, to underscore this point, I want to reread the last paragraph of the novel here. Ralph looked at him dumbly. This, of course, is right after the naval officer arrives on the shore, and the boys are finally saved from being stranded on the island. Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment, he had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches, but the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had... The tears began to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now for the first time on the island, great, shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them, with filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy. Now, when I think of Ralph at the end of the novel and this description that we get here of this great, tremendous sadness that he feels, and letting go of this grief and giving in to this incredible sadness, I think this is exactly what William Golding felt like looking at the rest of the world following the end of World War II. When that last bomb dropped and finally we had VJ Day, again, and then the bombs stop and the smoke clears. You can kind of imagine Golding looking at the rest of the world and feeling this same grief that Ralph feels at the end of the novel. And I have this theory that Golding kind of put himself as Ralph, probably identifies with Ralph at the end of this book. So that gives you kind of some background behind the writing of Lord of the Flies. Certainly not the prettiest of pictures, and it doesn't give us the happiest of books, to say the least. So throughout Lord of the Flies, Golding explores many questions. One of the things he's exploring here is how could the German people, the good German people, follow a man like Hitler? Just like in the novel, the boys seem to prefer Jack instead of Ralph. Everyone wants to say that they're going to follow Ralph, and they want to say that of course we're going to help you out, Ralph, and we're going to do the things that you say that we're going to do. But they seem to prefer Jack, and that's what kind of gives Jack the advantage on the island to start amassing his own little tribe. Another key question here is, why does mankind continue to wage war against itself? Just like the boys' civilization quickly dissolves into savagery and tribal conflict, the history of mankind in many ways is also a history of warfare. And it's kind of it's a deep question to think about why war exists and whether it's ever going to end, whether we're ever going to evolve as a civilization to the point where we're not dealing with these kind of things anymore. Another key question, will humanity destroy the entire planet before we come to our senses and change our ways? Just like the island at the end of the novel when the boys are supposedly saved, it requires, in order for the boys to get saved at the end of this novel, it requires a fire so large that it destroys the entire island. So when the boys are saved, and allowed to leave the island, you have to question, where's it going to go from there, right? Is warfare going to continue, and is that destruction going to continue in the rest of the world? And that, I think, is a key question that Golding is posing to the reader at the end of the book. Now, the setting, if you paid attention to the fine details of the novel, it takes place on a deserted island, tropical island, in the Pacific Ocean. It actually does mention the Pacific Tide in one of the lines. And what's happened is that these boys, their hometown has been attacked, and they were evacuated. They were all in a school together, an all-boys school, which would have been common in the 1950s in Britain. So they loaded a plane before their hometown is bombed, and they start flying, and it ends up getting shot down during this hypothetical World War III. The book also mentions the A-bomb, which means we're once again facing a nuclear war. However, once the boys crawl out of the jungle, they have a chance to create a utopia based on their own system of rules and laws, right? So what could possibly go wrong? A couple of key literary terms you want to associate with this book. The first one is allegory. The definition of an allegory, you should be familiar with this one by now. It's basically a book, a literary work. It could also be a play or a poem and other things, where all of the elements of the plot, the characters, the setting, the conflict, the events, they all have this kind of related symbolic meaning. And so there's always at least two ways, sometimes even more than two ways, of reading an allegory. There's the main plot, but then there's also what's being symbolized by the main plot. So by telling the story of the boys trying to survive on this island, Golding is symbolically telling other stories as well. Now, when we talk about allegory, of course we have to talk about symbolism, a term you're very well familiar with. Anytime you have a concrete image that represents an abstract idea, in order to create an effective allegory, a writer must use lots and lots of symbolism. Lord of the Flies is full of symbolic elements that create numerous allegories. in terms of symbolism, Lord of the Flies is one of the densest novels I've read. It's very impressive with the amount of symbolic aspects that there are to it. To give you a quick rundown of some of the main symbols that are frequently analyzed in this book, you have the actual Lord of the Flies itself. Now, the Lord of the Flies, literally all it is a decapitated pig on the end of a stick, and that stick is sharpened at both ends because they have to jam one end of it into the ground, and then the other end gets jammed into the skull. Now, of course, as it decays, it starts to attract all of these flies. So it's kind of like this weird, I hesitate to call it a sculpture. It's basically just this thing that is attracting flies, and it's designed to be a quote-unquote gift for this beast the boys think might be following them. But then, of course, there's that really weird scene where Simon comes across it, and it goes into this dreamlike state where the Lord of the Flies speaks to him. So it's the name that's given to the pig's head, and it's meant to symbolize the evil that all human beings are capable of committing. It's kind of symbolic of the fact that evil exists in everybody, and under the right conditions, even good people are capable of committing horrible acts. Down here we have a picture of the conch shell, which is one of the more obvious symbols in the book. It is the thing which calls all of the boys together. So it serves as a symbol of order and authority. You know, you have to hold the conch in order to speak. It's one of the things that is used to establish rules and laws, and it's also the thing that establishes Ralph as the chief. You know, they basically only elect him chief because he was the one who had the conch. Let's see, we also have the fire itself. So here's the fire. It's on the beach. Obviously, the original fire is up on the mountain. Fire, of course, is very symbolic in this book. It's a symbol of hope and rescue. It's also symbolic of their attachment to civilization. Ralph always reminds the boys, we can't we can help them to find us. We must make a fire, all right? So again, it serves this functional purpose of being a smoke signal, but symbolically, of course, it represents a lot more than just that. This idea that, you know, no matter how tough times get, we have to keep hope burning. We have to sort of keep the flames of hope alive, and, you know, it's the only way that we can hope for rescue and, you know, get back to our civilization. Piggy wears these glasses, and if you paid attention, you'll notice that the glasses slowly deteriorate throughout the book, much like the boys lose their civilized natures and their ability to think rationally. Piggy's glasses represent intelligence and rational thought. As they deteriorate throughout the book, the boys also slowly let go of their ability to think rationally. And then there's this idea of the beast. And the beast takes many shapes throughout the novel, and it's a very symbolic, thematic element to the entire book. It represents, the beast in general, represents the things in life we fear, primarily because we don't understand them. It's very similar to being scared of the dark. When you're a kid and you're in total darkness, very often you start to wonder what's out there, and you start to imagine things and see things that aren't there, and before you know it, you know, you can't sleep, and it really starts to, you know, weigh upon you. And so, you know, the beast basically is this irrational fear. Shadows also play a similar role in the novel. You'll notice that there are times in the novel where the island is very bright and luminous and, you know, fun and playful, but then shadows creep in to certain scenes, and again, there's that darkness. There's like, anytime shadows start to creep in and things get dark, we start to worry about the beast, and we start to imagine things. And the parachute, the guy who flies in on the parachute, this corpse, this dead guy who ejects from his plane right before it explodes, he ends up on top of the mountain. And, you know, again, the boys, they want to approach it, they want to see what it is, but then they're scared off when the parachute fills up with air. And, you know, they refuse to face their fears. And this is the thing that convinces everybody except Simon that there is an actual beast on the island. So there you go, the beast, like I say, this very dense, heavily symbolic aspect of the book. There's another wonderful term associated with this book called microcosm. When you break down the word microcosm, micro means small, and cosm, the same word that gives us cosmos, means world. So you look at the island itself, all right? The island is supposed to be a microcosm of planet Earth. What that means is what happens on the island represents what has happened on planet Earth. All right, so you've got this artist's rendering of the island here, and just look at how well laid out it is. You've got these polar opposites. You've got the mountain over here, which is where Ralph lays all of his priorities. We have to keep the fire going up here so that we can get off the island. And then way over here on the opposite end, you have Castle Rock, which we know this is Jack's fortress. He wants to hang out here. He's not concerned about getting off the island. He's got very different priorities. In the middle of the island here, we have Simon's beautiful little nature area, and then in the same general area, we have where the Lord of the Flies was created. Right here is the scar, so this is where the plane crashed on the island, and it crashes into the forest, destroys a bunch of the trees and a bunch of the land, but then is washed back out to the sea, leaving this huge scar, and that's what the boys crawl out of at the beginning of the book. Here's their bathing pool where they like to hang out, and then this is the place of Simon's death, where they have the fire on the beach. Over here, this little land bridge that you have to cross in order to get to Castle Rock also becomes the place of Piggy's death. But if you look at this island, which is described as being almost like a boat, it's like a boat-shaped island, all right? Some people have also pointed out that it almost looks like a mini little piglet. If you imagine the coral reef over here, kind of like a little pig's tail. A lot of people have pointed that out. But anyways, you've got this island kind of floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and just like planet Earth just kind of floats in orbit, right? That's really how we're supposed to look at this. What happens on this island is meant to sort of symbolize what has happened to mankind on planet Earth. So they inherit this land, they're allowed to create a civilization, they try to make things work, and then ultimately everything goes sour. And on planet Earth, especially at the end of World War II, you can see how you would make that connection for sure. Now, with the allegory of this novel, there's a couple of different ways you can look at it. There's a historical allegory where the characters represent specific people. So you can look at, in many ways, Jack representing this dictator, kind of like Hitler, who relies on fear to lead his people. That's his primary asset as a leader, is he's intimidating and he can bully people and he can make people afraid of him. And his best way of doing that is using a companion like Roger, who is this really threatening force, this maniacal force on the island, much like Joseph Mengele, was this really sinister Nazi doctor who would have struck fear into society in general. So the savages at the end of the book become kind of like the Nazis, and again, Roger could be compared to somebody like Mengele. Along the same token, you've got Ralph, Piggy, and Simon, who could represent the Allied forces, the democratic nations who were united by the conch, which of course is white and pure and delicate, right? And so they represent sort of the forces of goodness kind of fighting back. And the scorched island at the end of the novel represents the state of the planet following World War II. We also have, with this novel, a religious allegory. That's another way that people like to read this book. And if you're familiar at all, especially with the story of the Bible, William Golding himself was Catholic. So, he makes many obvious as well as many subtle references to stories from the Bible. Golding really fills the novel with references to stories from the Bible and the story of Jesus. In this way, Lord of the Flies can be read as a telling of the story of the fall of man from paradise and the eternal struggle between the forces of good and the forces of darkness that plague us to this day. In fact, the title of the book, Lord of the Flies, is a direct translation of the Hebrew word Beelzebub, which was the name they gave to the devil. So there is that, but then there are also several other biblical references. For instance, the first beast that is mentioned on the book is the snake beastie. This was referenced by the boy with the mulberry birthmark on his face, who then goes on to die in the first fire. It was an accidental death, but still, the first kid who mentions a beast ends up dying later, that I think the same day. And, again, it's that snake beastie, the mention of the snake, which is the biblical reference. Simon's nature area is often compared to the Garden of Eden, another reference to a biblical story. And then there's the symbolic aspect of the mountain and the fact that the boys have to keep the fire going, and the mountain is associated with being saved or salvation. So in many religious stories, mountains are very often associated with salvation and just the word itself, being saved, obviously has a religious connection. Simon is also a biblical name, so there is that. And a lot of people ask, so is Simon supposed to be Jesus? If you go online and do some searching on this, a lot of people say, yes, Simon is this Christ-like figure. Maybe, maybe not. All right. At the very least, Simon is supposed to represent a kind of spiritual force, maybe a prophet. Certainly, he's a potential savior. He's the only one who goes up and faces the beast and realizes that it's just a dead guy. And when he comes down and he tries to share this news with the other kids, that's when he's killed. So he was a potential savior in the book for sure. So again, many point out that he's this kind of Christ-like figure. He's spiritual, he's good, he's charitable. He likes, he helps the other kids out, like he gets them fruit from the trees, when they can't reach that high. He's kind of a loner. He's not really accepted by his peers. People don't really understand him. They describe him as being kind of cracked or batty. And ultimately, he's killed while trying to save the other boys from their fear of the beast. And of course, his death involves wooden sticks. Simon also suffers from epilepsy, which is why he has a seizure when he's facing the pig's head on the stick, and that's when it goes into arguably the weirdest part of the whole book, is when he's in the middle of the seizure looking at the Lord of the Flies, having this conversation with it. For many years, epilepsy was considered to be a holy disease that only afflicted prophets. So when somebody's eyes rolled up and they started convulsing and going into seizures, people thought that this person's receiving some kind of holy message. And so that is definitely intentional. Simon also delivers a prophecy to Ralph. He tells Ralph, you'll get off this island, and he does it while perched upon a rock. It has this kind of spiritual tone to how it's described. And then when he is facing the Lord of the Flies, the pig's head tries to tempt Simon away from his mission. Simon knows he has to climb the mountain. He doesn't think there's a beast, and he wants to try to save the boys from their own fear. And the pig's head tries to tempt him away from that. But he ends up doing it, and he ends up being killed as a result. So there you go. Allegory, symbolism, microcosm. There's a lot going on there. Then we get to term number 4, which is irony. This is a huge element of Lord of the Flies. We're going to talk about irony quite a bit throughout the school year. Irony in general is the difference between what one expects to happen and then what actually happens. Oftentimes it's the opposite of what we expect, and so when we're led to believe that one thing's going to happen and then the opposite occurs, that's sort of the foundation for irony. So there's lots of moments of irony throughout the book. A couple of them include the choir being the first ones to become violent. They kind of are the original army. They're the ones who have allegiance to Jack. Now, choirs, school choirs, of this nature, you would expect these boys to be the rule followers. These would be the boys who are singing the hymns, every day, and the ones who should be most familiar with spiritual teachings. So it's ironic that they're the first ones to let go of all of that. The fact that Jack ends up being the one who lights the fire that ends up rescuing the boys is incredibly ironic. Ralph spends the entire book laboring, trying to keep that fire going, and all of these things go wrong. But then, of course, at the end, Jack just lights this huge fire, and that's what actually attracts rescue. Definitely an ironic moment. Figurative language. Golding uses tons of figurative language in this book. Figurative language includes metaphor, simile, personification, anytime we're using kind of symbolic language in description especially. And he describes the island this way and the forest this way. I always say that the island itself is like another character in this book. At times the island seems alive, it seems threatening, it seems menacing. Other times it seems peaceful and relaxing. There's a lot of dense description in this book that it kind of bogs the novel down at times. You probably were a little bit bored from time to time by that. But just understand that it serves this kind of symbolic purpose in advancing a lot of the thematic concepts. All right, so let's finish this up. Some concluding thoughts. Lord of the Flies is definitely a challenging read first time around. I highly recommend reading it a second time. Once you have that understanding of what's going to happen and how it's going to unfold, reading it a second time is a very rewarding experience. You pick up on a lot more, especially during the moments of description. And just being prepared for the density of the symbolism and the figurative language. Another concluding thought here, in life, too many of us are like Ralph and Piggy, whereas too many other people are like Jack and Roger. And the problem is that when someone like Simon comes along and tries to get us to come to our senses, we often don't listen. You can look at the assassinations of many key individuals like John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Lincoln, and really countless others. People who we know were speaking really important truths, but who were assassinated as a result of their beliefs. And of course, Golding was not happy with the world when he wrote this book, so it's definitely not a happy story. And then, of course, when there are no females around to keep them in line, boys will be stupid. So there you go. That's a quick overview of some of the things we need to know about Lord of the Flies. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you in class.